Greetings, everyone, from Sarasota, Florida. My name is Ryan Lisk. I am the partner at Lisk Associates. We have offices here in Sarasota and in Lexington, Kentucky. The reason I'm bringing you a video today, I was at our annual conference in Scottsdale, Arizona back in January and presented a best practice that we have been using, which is an onboarding report, is how you would take someone through our custom onboarding report. You may or may not know this, but when we run what's called a TriMetrix HD report on candidates, I receive over 70 pages of information on them. And we dilute some of that down to just data. Sometimes it's data and feedback, it's interview questions, and we provide feedback on the fit for the candidate to the job that they're applying for. Now, a lot of times that information is great for the hiring decision, but then what can we do with the information after the hiring decision? And 70 pages is a lot of info. So what I've done is I have taken out all of the technical pages, the things with the graphs on them, things where you would need to be trained and certified to take somebody else through their report. And I've created what I might call a graphless onboarding report. So this report should be used by hiring managers. You don't need to have any technical expertise for this. As I walk you through this, you'll see these provide what I would call maybe thought starters or conversation starters. The idea being you want to get ahead of the curve and learn about this new person that you just hired, right? We used to say, hey, we hired workers, but human beings showed up. And this will help you see their perspective, how they like to be communicated with, what drives them, and how their talents will fit into the job. And each of these, for each individual client, yours may have a slight change to it, but for the most part, this process is going to stay the same. So here's a 20-page onboarding report. The person's name is Henry Hired for our example, and we hired Henry as a shift supervisor here at Lisk Associates. We have 20 pages. What we're going to do is divide this 20 pages into 3 separate onboarding sessions. So the pages are going to we're going to call this 866. So the first 8 pages of this report is going to be our first onboarding session. Then we're going to take the middle 6. And for our final onboarding session, we're going to look at the last 6 pages. You may want to do this in a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. I probably wouldn't let it go longer than maybe that first 3 months where you're doing an onboarding session each month. If you want to do it a little quicker, you can do it every other week or even weekly if you wanted to. So we have hired Henry, and we're going to have our first sort of professional development session. And the way I like to say this, Henry knows he took an assessment to get hired. He knows that we hire for fit, and so I want to present some of those results back to him. And so I set this up as, hey, as soon as we hire somebody, part of our culture here is we like to take them through some of what that assessment was. This generates some feedback, and I want to get to know you a little bit better. And for you hiring managers, I believe that this data is going to put you, I tend to say about 90 days ahead of the communication curve, and it will eliminate guessing with how to best communicate with, in this case, Henry. So let's go ahead and get started. And we've printed this report out, and I've brought a copy for Henry. And the first, after the title page, we have 4 pages of what's called general characteristics. And what I like to do here is I will say, all right, now Henry, as you read these paragraphs, as you read these 4 pages, what I would like for you to do is put a check mark by statements that are just spot on. That's you. Put an X by statements that aren't you. And what I like to say sometimes for things that make you say, I would put a question mark. So I do checks for things that sound just like you, X's for things that are not you, and then question marks for things that make you say, And then be quiet and let Henry read this and come up with his check marks, X's, and question marks. When he's completed this, at the end, I always ask, hey, Henry, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 that's nothing like me, and a 10 that's dead on, what number do you give this? How closely does this sound like you? And if you're getting scores, let's say, that are 5 or less, you would say, all right, well, that's not you. This isn't going to happen, most likely. He's going to say 7, 8, 9, or 10. All those scores are fine with me. If you get a really low score, you're going to want to find out what happened. And, we have had people in the past that ranked the answers backwards or things like that. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. He's going to give this a good solid score. He's going to say, hey, this is spot on. This is a 9 for me. And then I go to the conversation of, okay, well, tell me something that was spot on. What sentence really struck you? And tell me something you put maybe like a double check or a big check on. What is definitely you? And he's going to read a couple things to you. And then I'm asking, hey, is there anything that you put an X by? Anything you didn't agree with? And then finally I say, all right, were there anything that make you say, on there? And what were those kind of questions? And when he brings those up on those kind of statements, we may say, all right, well, let's watch for this, or let's see if somebody picks up on this. It'll be interesting to see. Or maybe, Henry, you can share this with somebody that knows you pretty well and see what they say about your checks, X's, and question marks. So that's just a simple conversation starter. That alone will probably take you 15 minutes to complete, right? By the time Henry reads this, checks things off, and you have that conversation. If you wanted to, you could send this to him ahead of time and have him do that assignment walking in. Next, value to the organization. This is a very positive list. On the general characteristics, there may be some things that Henry didn't like. So sometimes there are some statements that people may take as a negative about them. This page, you always will come back to this page. This is always very positive. It's a short bullet list. What I would do here, I would say, Henry, on this short list, check off the top 3 things on this list, and here's how you read this. So after someone has a meeting with you or an encounter with you, or maybe when you've changed jobs, how do you want to be remembered? So what are the top 3 things on this list you most would like to be remembered for? How do you want to be known as a person, or maybe as a leader? How would you like to be seen as a leader? How would you like to be seen as a salesperson? Or in this case, Henry, how would you like to be known as a shift supervisor for us? So Henry's going to check off those top 3. We can say, hey, tell me what you checked off. Why did you check those? What makes you say you want to be known as a team player? Why is that important to you? So it's just the follow-up kind of process, just the conversation. It's what we would call one more question. He does the exercise, asks one more question on those statements. And then finally, for the first onboarding session, we have checklists for communicating. We call these the do's and don'ts. So there's 2 pages here. On this first page, checklist for communicating, we're going to say, okay, Henry, on this bullet list here, check off your top 3. Here's how you read this list. On this page, what are the top 3 things you most like other people to do to you from a communication perspective? So how do you prefer to be communicated with? What are some things that you like that are on this list? What are your top 3? And he's going to go through. He's going to clearly check off his top 3. We're going to ask him why he checked those off. And you're going to say as his hiring manager, hey, I'm going to try to do some of that to you. I'll make an intentional effort to do that for you. I want to be, make sure that I'm communicating with you in a way that you like. Now, let's look at the opposite page. Henry, this is the opposite of the do's. We call these the don'ts, or ways not to communicate with you. So as you read this list, what are the top 3 things on this list you don't want others to do to you from a communication perspective? So he's going to check off his top 3, and I sometimes make a little joke like I've maybe already done some of these to you. I hope not, and I will try to avoid doing those in the future. And then the reason we have him check off 3, it's hard to remember all 12 of these, and if you have a staff of 8, 9, or 10 people or more, it's going to be hard to remember all these for all the people. But I can remember 3 that my new hire just told me not to do. I can do that. And that gets you through page 8. So that's your first onboarding session. That conversation, we usually do this when I run a workshop. I get through these first 8 pages. It's about 25 minutes. And so if you have some back and forth conversation, maybe it's a little longer for you. And I don't want to make this too complex. I want to just show you this one report. But remember now, if you're a hiring manager, you may have your own report. What a great time to share your do's and don'ts and your general characteristics and things about you that Henry can pick up on. So he actually begins to communicate with you in a way that you prefer as well. Sort of a win-win for you there. All right. So that's the end of onboarding session 1. It's almost like a micro-learning. I think if we go too long in these onboarding sessions, imagine trying to take somebody through 70 pages in one setting, right? Or what about 40 pages? So I think I like 8. I like the conversation. It's fresh. You keep things moving. and they stay top of mind. So this doesn't get lost down the road. Let's talk about onboarding session number 2. So Henry's been at work now for, let's say we've decided to do these every 2 weeks. So we're going to do this as a 6-week onboarding with this report. And he comes back in 2 weeks, and we're going to look at this section 2. So we may do a brief review. Henry, remember the do's and don'ts for communicating? How are those going? Do you feel like you're, how are you fitting in with the group? What are you picking up on? Things like that. And then we're going to say, all right, let's look at this second section to this. So the second section starts with, this section's called integrating behaviors and driving forces, is where we pick up. So the first page is called potential behavioral and motivational strengths. Now we have a bullet list here, and I don't know, we have 12, 13, 14 bullets here. We have a little bit longer list. And to mix it up, I mean, one thing I could do, since we just did 2 weeks ago, we did the exercise of checks, X's, and question marks. If you feel like that went really well and you want to go back to that, you can certainly do this. So if that was the case, you could say, all right, Henry, this first statement here on your strengths utilizes people to win and accomplish goals. And if he's going to say, oh yeah, that's me exactly, he's going to put a big check mark there. If he says that's not him, he's going to put an X. Or if he says, ooh, I don't know, I try to do that, maybe that's a question mark for him. So you could do that. And that would work just fine. Let me give you a second option. If you wanted to mix it up a little bit, let's look at this page and let's look at that first statement again. Henry utilizes people to win and accomplish goals. Now, if I said, hey, Henry, rank that statement on a scale of 1 to 5. A 1, I totally disagree with that statement. A 2, I somewhat disagree with that statement. A 3, I'm neutral. A 4, I somewhat agree, and a 5, I totally agree with that statement. Now I got him thinking a little bit deeper on a 1 through 5, and I'm going to say, hey, Henry, the only time you get to use a neutral is if this is something that hasn't ever happened to you. So if you've had no experience with this statement, you can give it a 3 because you don't know. Otherwise, I want you to have a little lean one way or the other. I want you to have a little bit of an opinion. And you'll see he might discern a 4 from a 5 or something that he really resonates with. And let him go through and rank all those statements there on a 1 through 5 kind of scale like that. All right. We would do the same pattern on the conflict. All right. Now, these are tougher statements. So these are going to come across as, these would be things that are going to hinder, or these may be roadblocks, or as the report points out, conflict for him. So this is more of a trouble spot. So in onboarding session 1, right, it was all positive. There was no right or wrong. There was no good or bad. It was just statements that were generated based on the scores Henry put into the system when he applied for this job. Now we're doing a little bit deeper feedback. So we're looking at this page. This page has some tougher statements on it. And then it's the same thing. Hey, rank these on a 1 through 5. 1, I totally disagree. 2, I somewhat disagree. A 3, I'm neutral. 4, I somewhat agree. And a 5, I totally agree with these statements. What you will find, right, because of the page before, the strengths page is very positive, and we believe those strengths, you're going to see a lot more 4s and 5s. On this page, don't be surprised if you start to see more 1s and 2s. And this is a great place for you as a leader to start some awareness with Henry, if that's the case, on, what happened here. Did this page now all of a sudden, this page isn't true, but everything else you've done to this point was spot on in the computer? What happened? So it's a great place to really start learning and start saying, hey, here's some things to look out for, and really starting to develop, especially if this is kind of like a leadership position. This fits for any position. I use this for everything from, security officers to CEOs. So we're completely across the board. It doesn't matter what the job is in the organization. This page still holds water, and they need to be aware of how they may be perceived. So that's a great conversation page. And you can ask on any of the statements, hey, why'd you give that a 1? Why'd you give that a 5? That's all you have to do here is start with the conversation. And then finally, the third page of this is called areas for improvement. So areas for improvement, this is also some things that he may need to work on. And I do the same thing here. It's, this may be even a level deeper than the conflict page. So these would be things that we may work on together. So if he puts this as a 5, hey, what if on statement 1, Henry has a tendency to be too verbal in expressing criticism? Well, if he totally agrees with that, I ask, well, do you think that's going to get you in some trouble on the job, or do you think that's going to be a potential issue? And he's like, well, maybe it could be. Well, now we've just agreed that, all right, let's keep an eye on that and let's see how that goes. So those are your 3 pages, 1 through 5. You can talk about every statement that's on there. You end up having about 35 statements or so to have conversation around. Then the last 2 pages in onboarding session 2 are keys to motivating and keys to managing. So here's keys to motivating. So Henry wants, and what I would do here, you could go back to checking off the top 3 on this page. So Henry, on this page, what are the top 3 things that you would most want in this job? What do you feel like you really want? And he's going to check off his top 3. And let's say we say, all right, what's your number 1? And he says, he wants public recognition of power and prestige. Public recognition of power and prestige. So, he's like, I don't really need that, or maybe he does want that. He checked it off and it's on there. So one thing I could do as a manager when I see a clue like that, I'm going to call Henry out when something good's happened, right? I'm going to call him out in front of everybody and tell him what a good job he's doing. That's public recognition of power and prestige. So the power being, in some ways his boss is calling him out in front of others. He will find that energizing and motivating. So why this page matters to you as a hiring manager, this page is all about Henry's intrinsic motivation. So if I can give him everything that's on this page, he'll be more engaged. He's going to be motivated. And those are 2 things that we're constantly working on, keeping people engaged. You have a 2 in 3 shot of people being disengaged. So to capture that 1/3, that's where you're really going to start winning the game. The next page and the final page in onboarding session 2 is keys to managing. So keys to managing, these are his needs. So the last page was his wants. And by the way, on the wants, if you look down the list on almost everybody that you're talking to, they don't cost the organization anything. It doesn't cost anything. There's no hard cost to me giving Henry some public recognition and some public praise, right? That doesn't cost our company anything. Now, here's the needs. So same thing. Henry, check off your top 3 needs. What do you need? And that will help me be a better manager for you. And so now here I'm becoming a little bit vulnerable. If I'm his boss, I'm saying, hey, what do you need from me and how can I help you? So those are 2 good questions. And whatever he checks off here is fine. And you're going to want to pay attention to whatever it is that, let's say he checks off statement number 3 there, to set realistic. Henry needs to set realistic goals that can be accomplished while improving the organizational recognition. So we can work on that together. So maybe at this point he's been on the job 2 or 3 weeks. Maybe he doesn't even have goals set yet, but yet we can help. Now we have that statement. I can help him do that. I know what that's important to him. All right. So again, putting you as his manager 90 days ahead of the curve, right? So that's it for onboarding section 2. It's only 6 pages, but there's a ton of conversation around these 6 pages. As you can tell, you can have them anything they do to check a bullet, check a statement, rank it 1 through 5, X's, question marks, rank your top 3. Those are all good signs for you to ask more questions, have conversation around, and improve how to manage this new person. Finally, onboarding session number 3. So we're starting on page 15. These are the last 6 pages in this onboarding report. This is called competency section. Now, when he took his trimetrics, we measure 25 competencies in the tool that we use. So here's a list of the 25 on this development indicator. So it ranks them in a 1 through 25 kind of format. It's color coded. So the dark blue are skills or competencies that Henry has well developed. Let's call it the medium blue are things that he has developed. The gray is moderately developed, and then the white needs developed. Now, in Henry's case, he has nothing that fell into the white category of needs development. So that's a good sign for us. It's telling us, hey, Henry thinks he's got a lot of these skills developed. What I would like to do, if you have a job benchmark for the position Henry just got hired for, you should have the top 7 or so competencies of this job. So what skills does this particular job need to be a top performer? And what you're going to want to do is compare that list to Henry's list. And one little trick that we use here, we have a book that's called The Complete Leader. And The Complete Leader acts as a field guide for us. And so let's just say that we needed, let's see, so for shift supervisor, we wanted planning and organizing. So that's Henry's skill number 23. Planning and organizing, let's say, was on the competency list for this particular job as being very important. You got to plan, you got to be organized for this position. Well, Henry scored a little bit below the national average on that one. So that's a place for us to look at development. All right, that's where we look at development only because he needs it for this particular job. So I would simply turn to the chapter in The Complete Leader on planning and organizing. It's going to give Henry some exercises, some suggestions, some things that he can do. And so in between this meeting and our next meeting, we're going to talk about, hey, how's it going in planning and organizing? What have you done? What exercises did you do out in the field to sort of help you develop that skill? So it becomes intentional on him. He's got a purpose about trying to develop that. Let's look at his personal skills number 2, leadership. Leadership was also a competency that was needed for superior performance in this shift supervisor position. Now, Henry's indicated he's already good at leadership, but so we really believe in going in sort of the good to great philosophy. So we want to make sure we don't forget about leadership because you're good at it. We want to add to that. It should be easier for him to lead in this position. So we can also use The Complete Leader in the book, in the field guide, to have him continually sharpening his saw, sharpening his blade when it comes to leadership, so we can get him going from good to great in this position on that competency. The last 5 pages are simply a ranking. This is the only date I put in here in this onboarding report, simply because I found it very intuitive and easy to understand. So for instance, if we looked at, there's leadership, right? His number 2 competency, we give a brief definition: achieving extraordinary business results through people. The national average is going to be that number in the middle there below. So the national average is 61. He has scored a 100. That red bar captures the national mainstream, or let's say it's a bell curve, right? Is what that would be. So Henry has scored outside of the bell curve on the high side on that particular competency. So that's a good thing. We would expect him to show good leadership skills in this position. All right. Well, that's how to take somebody through their 3 onboarding sessions. And I hope you found this video useful. I look forward to hearing great results, and hey, great hires and happy onboarding. Thanks.